Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Linda S. Cordell Lecture here at the School for Advanced Research. I'm Tim Pocketet. I'm the new director of the SAR Press, senior scholar, and a former Weatherhead fellow here on campus a few years ago. The annual Cordell Lecture honors work in archaeology that best represents the scholarship of the late Linda Cordell, a prominent Southwest archaeologist, a professor at UNM and UC Boulder, and a friend of the greater SAR community here in Santa Fe. Events like these are made possible by the generous support of our donors and members. If you'd like more information on becoming an SAR member, you can see any one of the staff here in the room or log on to sarweb.org. If you want to become a donor, it's even easier. Before I introduce our featured speaker, I'd like to recognize members of our board of directors who are here tonight. Thank you. Thank you for your ongoing commitment and for your support. And I would like to thank the generous sponsors who have made this event possible, some of whom are anonymous, and others of whom include Andrea Fisher Fine Pottery, As Above So Below, Dan Marion's UBS Financial Services, Fay Creative, the Flora Crichton Lecture Fund, Founder Society members, the Luke and Betty Vortman Endowment Fund, the Patricia G. Foshee Charitable Fund, Shiprock Santa Fe, Thornburg Investment Management, and Zappelin Lampert Gallery. All right. Few scholars have shaped our understanding of ancient writing and the Maya civilization of Mesoamerica as profoundly as Dr. Stephen D. Houston. Dr. Houston is SAR's inaugural Barbara Tedlock Fellow, the Dupee Family Professor of Social Science at Brown University, a MacArthur Fellow, and recipient of Guatemala's highest honor, the Order of the Quetzal. His archaeological field projects have taken place at some of the great ancient cities of Guatemala, Camanalhuyu, Dos Pilas, and El Zotz. His more than a dozen books on Maya history, forgive me, I don't know how, there's more, but I could count over a dozen. On Maya history, kingship, and epigraphy include such titles as A Maya Universe in Stone, The Memory of Bones, and First Writing, Script Invention as History and Process. The title of his talk tonight is Inventing Otherworldly Writing. Now, as a friendly reminder, I would like to ask you to please check your cell phones and other devices and set them to silent. And then join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen D. Houston.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tim. And it really is a pleasure to be here, and partly in honor of Linda Cordell, who was a delightful person. And the Tedlocks also were personal friends from way back. And so it's truly, I really cherish this moment among you and here on this beautiful campus. Now, I'm going to also take you to a very different place, not Santa Fe, but we're going to be going to the Italian peninsula, where this book was published in 1539. It's got a long Latin title there, which I won't bother you with, but it was prepared by someone named Teseo Ambrogio degli Albonese. And in this, you see, or we see as scholars, one of the very first compendia of a variety of different languages, all brought together in this volume. Now, the reason he prepared this, which I will elucidate or elaborate on in a few minutes or so, had a lot to do with esotericism of the time and the assimilation into Christian thinking and of very advanced Christian and Catholic theologians of the time of Kabbalah, of Kabbalistic understanding that was partly coming out of the Middle East and out of the Jewish tradition as well. He was very interested in this concept of Hebrew as the first language of humanity. The other thing, though, is that if you leaf through that book, eventually you get to an astonishing appendix. And this is it before you. It has a series of remarkable interlocutors or interactions that are taking place that are purportedly recorded here in a document that was not directly acquired by Ambrogio, but rather came from another figure whom I will mention right now. He was a magus named Lodovico de Spoletano, also obviously Italian. But what this document purports to tell us is an extraordinary, almost miraculous interaction between this magus, this learned esotericist, occultist, and a demon who had three names, Talion, Ancion, and Amilon, probably an allusion to some subversion of the Trinity, three names in one. Talion also means someone who's intent on retribution. So there's a jagged, harsh quality to this interaction. Now, in this document, in the Latin portion, the magus is said to have asked a really banal question. Has Cavaliero Marco Antonio, son of a rich woman from Piacenza, found all the dinars, that is, gold pieces, that Antonio Maria left? And if not, where are they? It's not highly elevated theological discourse going on here. You think they'd be asking better questions. But it is said in this accompanying Latin text that a pen, a quill, magically levitated in the air and wrote out a response in unreadable, devilish script. And that's what you're looking at down below. Now, there's a lot of lore and reception about this notorious document. For instance, de Spoletano himself was said to have been, and I found this in an obscure 18th century German source, stabbed to death by peasants with dung forks. Didn't end happily for him. But it was also an object of much royal interest, particularly Charles II and his wife Catherine de Braganza of Portugal, who on September 29th, 1663, soon after his ascension to rule there in England, decided they had to get to Oxford, to Queen's College, to see a copy of this, which he did in the company of someone who eventually became James II. So there's a lot of royal gawking going on. It's recorded at the time. And even into the 18th century, there are poets and undergraduates going to consult this document in Oxford. A poem is written. No more, ye critics, be your brains perplexed to elucidate the darkness of the text. No further in the endless search proceed. The devil wrote it, let the devil read. And Ambrosio himself said, I don't know how to read this, and this was apparently also the case. No one knows how to decipher this text. And I've tried my hand at that, and I have some practice at it. This document is recorded in a number of different examples. Typically, it's mutilated. Someone has ripped out these pages, or you can see here an overstrike in a copy that is in the Wellcome Library in London. Now, what can we say about this as a system? And I'm purely viewing this as someone who's interested in cryptography and decoding. Well, first of all, there's no cursive or italic. It has harsh, angular outlines, as you can see. It's red, I think you can all tangibly make out from top to bottom. From the lowest line, you know that it's red, much like English or Latin might be. There are approximately 35 distinct signs in it. One is repeated about 10 times, and it's also what we call a specialist calibrated writing, by which all the signs are exactly the same size. So they're aggressive, they're somewhat harsh, and why not add pitchforks and whiplash tails just to give it a kind of font? Now, there are also, I believe, almost nods to the alchemical esotericism of the time, which you probably know was led to Dr. Faustus and other kinds of figures. And if you look very carefully there at the very final squiggle, it is probably the sign for Mercury, which is used by alchemical figures in the vain attempt to transform base materials into gold. And I think it's also underscoring the venal cupidity of this node. It's banal. It's about where the dinars are. Where is the money? What is going on here is really much more interesting, perhaps, as we view this analytically, which is that it's mimicking writing. We can't decipher it. I don't think it's decipherable. Is it purely an imposture, or is it a vision from some deluded person? It's a little bit hard to say, but it is intended to be a record of language. Now, why would this be going on at this time? Well, one reason is because there are lots of humanist inventions in devising writing systems, the most famous of which is Moore's alphabet from his great book, Utopia. You can see the kind of geometrical precisions that are playing out, in which we have forms that move at 90 to 80, 180 degrees, and then correlating with an alphabet up above. So it's concerned with precision, with analytical rigor, with logic. And in addition to that, this is the time of printing in which people have become quite interested in fonts and being able to codify typefaces. It is also the time, as with Ambrogio's volume, in which there are these vast compendia of different writing systems being brought together. Again, as I alluded to before, the reason for that is they're trying to claw back, almost by a sort of philological process, to the first language of people, which would be not Hebrew, which was thought to be somewhat decayed from that, but close to it. And by drawing together all of these scripts, we would be able to find the original one. And one of the people involved in this is a figure I'll return to later, Guillaume Postel, who might have given Spoletano's purported script to Ambrogio himself. Now, there are other things going on. As we pull away from this in terms of intellectual and spiritual history of the time, this is, of course, the time of Luther. They overlap. 1539, Luther is still alive. It is a moment of crisis in which the Catholic Church, thought to be universal, is beginning to splinter. But there's another more subtle theological point that I will be getting back to later, and introduces two terms, one of which is supernatural, which you all know, and the other, which is a little fancier, it's a 10-cent word, is preternatural. Now, the preternatural concept, and I take this idea from Carlos Eyre at Yale, is this idea that you're both in and outside the world simultaneously. You're both there materially in the world, but also floating above ethereally. And it's a bit of a paradox, you might say. It's a fundamental point that is going to affect our interpretation of this script from this document from 1539. Because what it is arguing is that evil is present, that evil has instantiated itself in the world, it's made itself materially present in the script. That must be why all that royal gawking took place, because there was that special frisson of being close to the devil himself, or one of them. Now, the other thing I would say, though, is if you think about it logically, if there were evil in the world, there would also be good. And so, in a way, and this is worked out at the time theologically, the devils are also seen perversely almost as servants of God. And by their existence, evil also it presupposes a higher, beneficent good, one that is overriding all and that is equally preternatural, that is equally present in the world. And that's a welcome miracle. So ultimately, when you look at the devil's writing, and this is a term that is very common in anthropology, this is the ultimate other. This is a non-human creature. And by looking at the devil in this way, you're also attaining, to some extent, a reciprocal definition of what people might be. Now, how did I come to this topic? Some of you think you came to a Mayanist talk. There isn't any Mayanist material in this at all. So I've gone through a strange personal journey. There's a shameless plug to my next book, which comes from my Mellon lectures at the National Gallery of Art. So I've done a lot of work on decoding, as of course you heard in the very gracious introduction. But I've also been fascinated by writing systems across the world. And it became clear to me early on that to engage in that particular study, you have to get other specialists. You cannot, in your own brain, comprehend all of the knowledge that needs to be there for any kind of rigorous comparative study. And so I was looking at the birth of writing. Then I looked at, why not look at the death of writing? And then here at the SAR, I did an advanced seminar in which I looked at what happens between birth and death, that is the lifespan of writing. And more recently, I've been looking at aesthetic experiments like what I call slow writing, that is difficult to read, or that might just consist of markings of meaning. But specifically, the proximate motivation for this talk is an article I did with my, what will be my co-author, the essay that comes from this talk, which was just finished a couple of hours ago, is one in which I'm looking at what I call secondary scripts. Now, this is jargon, you'll have to forgive me for this, but secondary scripts are ones that contrast with what we would call primary inventions. Now, a primary invention of a writing system, such as in this example from the UJ tomb in Hierakonpolis in Egypt, or below oracle bone script, which comes from, I believe, Anyang, it's a Shang Chinese script, is that these coalesce at a time when no one knows writing exists, that there's no such formal systematization, there's no codification of sound or language into records of a material sort. There are ones you know about. So running here from left to right, You've got, of course, Egypt, cuneiform, Indus. You've got the oracle bone script we looked at before. And then way over there in the New World is a writing system that I helped to report on in the journal Science with colleagues about 20 years ago. It's called the Cascajal writing system, the earliest in the New World. Now, why is this important? Why are we looking at this inherently from a comparative advantage? Because there can be no diffusion here. These are independent inventions as far as we can understand, although there's some controversies. Now, that's not the subject tonight. What I'm going to look at instead are secondary scripts which Felipe Rojas and I have identified as an interesting, an intriguing, and I think important academic topic. These are situations in which people know writing exists, and then they create their own in response to it. A great example is, of course, runic, which you see over to the side, and what is arguably the earliest runic text, which comes from Norway, not too far north from Oslo. Now, how to model this process? I think what one does first is you think of the source. That is, what is the original inspiration that they're looking at? And then it's going to have a derivation. But in terms of runic, what does it come from? Well, the consensus now among scholars is that it comes from a transformation of Latin writing. And then why is that? It's because Marcus Aurelius is shooting up, as you probably know from your Roman history, into Germany. They are using Latin writing. They're mercenaries, probably coming down from Scandinavia. And they're on the cusp of the edge, the margins of the Roman Empire, but slightly beyond it. They create their own writing system. And this is the one that we call Scandinavian runic, again shown here by the Svingerud stone. Now, if we think about the devil's writing, it's an example of secondary script invention, because I will confess to you now, I don't believe in devils. I don't think the devil was levitating a pen. One can choose to have that interpretation, but I think as we draw back, there are actually more interesting historical and cultural processes going on. So let's start with Postel. Remember, he was probably the one who passed on this document to Ambrogio. That's the source. It's a known writing system, and there could have been other models. The demon's response is a secondary invention. It's going through all of the same kinds of processes that we've seen before. Now, how do we encapsulate those? Well, first of all, we can say these secondary inventions are ones that usually involve embattled identities. You see the Romans. We are not Roman. How do we define ourselves with respect to them in ways that help to establish or devise a contrastive identity? You're very concerned with who isn't like you, who is like us. There's also undeniably both that contrastive element, because runic doesn't really look exactly like Latin writing, but fundamentally it's emulative. You're trying to make it look a lot like that other writing system. And then finally, you are recording language, or at least its semblance. And this is the kind of pseudo-writing that we're looking at. Now let me step away to another topic that will be of interest to you who, we're in Santa Fe. Doesn't George Martin live here? I think he does. This is where people write about and think seriously about Dothraki and Valyrian and so forth. These kind of devised languages, now deployed in Hollywood, are called, by our jargon, conlangs. Really ugly word, but I didn't make it up. These are self-consciously constructed for a reason. They're meant to be languages, and so you can go back a little bit further beyond Peterson, who worked on the Game of Thrones languages. You can go to Klingon, for heaven's sake. You can go back to Tolkien. Now, I'm going to make up a word because that's my God-given right as an academic. Conscript, it sounds a lot better to me than conlang. These are constructed scripts. And I find it puzzling that when you look at all of this literature in conlangs, they just blur language and writing as though these are one and the same. Now, conscripts would include things like this very famous document by Hildegard of Bingen, who had these brightly effusive visions that were suffused with all sorts of color hallucinations, wild stuff to read. And this is the only example of it that comes from her pen, dating to about AD 1200. You can see a constructed writing system down below. Now, most of these constructed writing systems are basically presented to us as lists. I think it's mostly to facilitate transmission. They're meant to be used. And so we have the abecedaries you probably heard about. Here's an example of an ABC. And we all knew from painful childhoods that we had to memorize these by songs. And why not include Edward Gorey? N is for Neville, who died of ennui. That is meant to, in a way, make a larger point about the segregation of sound and how you learn about it. Now, there's a subset, though. Languages and writing systems that are never meant to be used. And that would, I would tell you, would subsume here this example from Hildegard of Bingen. In her own words, she wrote of this, it is an unknown language, they're unknown letters. In other words, we're looking here at the presence of the miraculous, the presence of the awesome, not in that Gen Z use of that term, but truly something that inspires awe. And they are themselves testimonies to the spiritual presence of some of these larger forces. This is going on all the time. If you go to the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, if it's not shut down by certain authorities, you will see there this, which is something created by someone who in his day job was a custodian for the GSA in DC, but his night work, he would spend decades working on this, was as director of special projects for Eternity. And in his garage, he created this altar of God, but he also created a book with the same kind of miraculous text. And it's on display today. You can see also commensurations. And what I mean by that is you'll have to have the Latin script up above, and then embedded within it is going to be a writing system all to its own. Now, for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to give you two broad domains by which we can look at secondary inventions. And what is a little bit unusual about this talk is that we have decided to, we elected to focus on creation supposedly of non-humans. That is, this fundamentally cultural attribute, writing, one that we think about as something found across the world, frequently reinvented and invented again through eternity, I imagine, is actually held in some places to pre-exist humanity, to be a gift of other peoples. And I'm going to divide this, therefore, first into a section where we're looking at the writing of devils, which you've been introduced to, the writing of angels, to which you have not, and the writing of God himself. And then finally, since we're close to Roswell, aliens. Now let's talk first about the writing of devils, angels, and gods. Now there are more than one devil letter. There is, for instance, the letter which comes to us from furthest Sicily. It survives in a number of different examples. It is fascinating culturally for a number of reasons, mostly in terms of literary history, because this is a distant relative of the Prince de Lampedusa, who wrote The Leopard, now made recently into a rather great movie on Netflix, I might add. She became a nun, and she had this tumultuous struggle with the devil. She was found the next morning, purportedly, covered in blotches of ink, and she had produced a document which represented a kind of spiritual conflict or combat with a whole host of devils who had visited her. And this is what she wrote. And so it's not so much the levitated pen or quill that we saw with Ambrogio. In this case, it's her hand as a demoniac being possessed by the quill. And it is in an undecipherable writing system. Now, there are timid little Italian words that pop up mid-text, including my favorite, ohime, woe is me. In other words, she's struggling, she's released intermittently. It's quite a performance that's being laid out here. Now again, I don't touch on her sincerity. She probably believed absolutely this was going on. It's not so interesting to me, but rather her own self-description, as with Hildegard of Bingen, is to say this is in unknown and barbaric characters. Now, it's a writing system. How do we know? Read top to bottom, left to right. What does that remind you of? It's calibrated. All the signs are the same size. It starts in a lowercase, and by the end, in her, presumably her enthusiasm or impassioned state, she starts going into capital letters. It is clearly a language mimic, just because of this long sequence of glyphs. And occasionally, you'll see sprinkled without it throughout this document, alchemical notations. Okay. And then I love this. At the end is a little signature by the devils. They're not happy, but they've decided to sign this document. So it's mimicking a contractual kind of document. And these kind of contractual documents also lead to, and several exist, these kind of interlocutions, these interactions with devils are fascinating to me because apparently the devil has a whole bunch of different writing systems. Polygraphic is the word for it. So you compare here the Ambrosio example with that from Sister Maria working about a century and a half later. That's not the end of them. There's this one, which is almost certainly a forgery. It was published in the early 19th century at the beginnings of interest in demonic and satanic practices. But it again is using this kind of legal template, a kind of contractual understanding of how writing is supposed to appear on the page. And all was venal, all was banal, not struggling for souls, but this is promising someone a lot of sex and lots of money. And then you see down there in the lower right-hand side, in the middle of this document, all of the different bureaucrats from hell who have come along and signed this document, ostensibly in a very different style, obviously done by the same hand. So those are the devil's hieroglyphs. And then down below is the scribe. That's the devil scribe. His name is Bilbereth, apparently. Now, so that's the evil. That's the devil. That's the malevolent. Are there supernatural forces that also are commandeering the resources of writing, but from an angelic, beneficent perspective? Indeed there are, and these are called angelic ring signs, and there's a numbing complexity of research about this, which I'm not going to go into. They seem to come into existence probably when Egyptian writing is beginning to lapse into obscurity. People can't read it anymore, and there's this, there are fantastical ideas about what Egyptian hieroglyphs are saying, and it's precisely at this moment that they begin to create this kind of script. And what does it look like? It has rings or little circles at the end of the staves. And that's why they're sometimes called rings. This is being attributed to a particular angel. This is what's fascinating in terms of what I had indicated before. It underscored that property of writing systems potentially existing prior to humans, existing prior to the advent of humanity. And what better example of this would be this page, which comes from the last man to know everything, Athanasius Kircher. He wrote prodigious amounts of dross and rubbish. And here you can see his script, which he thought came from the archangel Michael, presumably pre-existing humans. And it's alphabetic version of a celestial or starry writing. Now, why is he including that particular epithet or descriptive? Because he saw it in the heavens. You're not seeing the aurora borealis that we're seeing over the last couple of days, and tonight, I'm told, spectacularly, but rather he would look up at the stars and not necessarily see all the zodiacal signs, but rather he would see the writing of God, eternally recorded up there, which implies that it is of exceptional antiquity. So that's a completely non-human writing system used by later alchemists and occultists and so forth. But there is a Latin version of this, which I was astonished to see when I was visiting Vienna 2 years ago with my wife. It is reported in a document. This is one of the great treasures of the Habsburg dynasty. It's in the Schatzkammer in Vienna, and it's an agate bowl which was thought to be the Holy Grail by the Habsburg family, to the extent that it became an inalienable property of the monarchy. Now, this agate object, probably late Roman, we think about 300 AD approximately, has on it, if you squint, as they did in the past, Latin lettering. The bands are not simply there naturally, they're spelling out in Latin from a time beyond imagining a message from God in this object, which was held by the Habsburgs to be the Holy Grail itself. And so there you see a kind of abbreviated version, and again, it must have been a lot of squinting. Bless her Christ, the eternal triune King. Why is this interesting? It's because this had to have been there from the time of creation. It's stone. It's not created by human. It's created by very peoples long, long before. It is, therefore, a timeless writing system from creation itself, and therefore takes it beyond any possibility of human concoction. Now, aliens are always going to bring in an audience. I hope it brought in some of you tonight. I began, as I was conceptualizing this process, to realize alien writing is a lot like what we've been seeing here, in that Do I think aliens are visiting Roswell? Well, I don't know. You may have your opinions. I don't want to enrage people in this audience, but the fact of the matter is, it's unlikely that they left that thing there. That is the violet-colored writing, which is supposedly on something called the I-beam from Roswell. Now, this is the Roswell incident. We don't need to go over this, right? There's no need to describe this. It's the first case study, as I wind my way through this talk, in which we're looking at a secondary script invention. I don't think aliens are doing it. I think it's being concocted. This one is fascinating in almost, I don't know, juridical terms and how they're evaluating the evidence, because the fact of the matter is that I-beam has disappeared. I don't know if it's been sucked up by magnet beam into a flying saucer. It just has disappeared. But there's a long set of personal testimonies by someone who's thought to have seen it. It's a little like golden plates, which we know from some important religious traditions, for instance. Now, what can we say about this? It was purportedly seen by someone named Jesse Marcel Sr., who then also mentioned to Junior of the same name in 1980 or later the existence of this I-beam. And it was drawn out for you. I think all of you can make out as you look at that, as you strain your own eyes. You don't have to look at an agate bowl to see that's probably a kind of writing. The process by which they go out of their way to affirm the veracity, the truthfulness of the document involves affidavits, it involves simulated technical reports, a lot of dates, which you see here, 3rd of October, 89, December 12th, 1989. It's being laid out almost as a kind of legal case, hoping that you're going to believe this thing existed. And then the accounts are constantly evolving, as Ben Saylor pointed out many years ago in his study of this, a great anthropologist at Brandeis. And then this is the important thing. They want to remove the mysticism by noting down below, this is by one of the Marcels, this was seen and copied from memory. It was not hypnotically retrieved. So there you go. Okay, I look at this as someone who spends a lot of time looking at writing systems. There are distinct signs. They're calibrated. They're in a horizontal order. They're sequential, so you're beginning to invoke that concept of a language mimic. And then this is, I think, the really wonderful touch here. They have a kind of parabolic font, which is sort of scientistic. It looks as though you're looking at a particular document. And then down below, I don't know if you can make it out, here in the screen it says, all characters in violet. So it has this lurid mauve glow to it, more or less. Why am I bringing this up? Because all of these accounts we've been looking at of secondary invention in terms of how they come about involve fables. They involve testimonials and elaborate stories, which come down to us indirectly through Ambrogio, which come down to us directly through Sister Maria there in her closed convent in Sicily. And those narratives introduce to me an interesting dimension here, which is the moral ambiguity of all these documents. And I touched on this a little bit when we were exploring the theology of the time in the early modern period. Now, Roswell we all know about. It's all about government mendacity. They're hiding things from us. We've heard this before. And then if we look at it from another prism, through another aspect of this prism, there is a statement about the aliens, which is they're organ harvesting, they abduct us, they're all proctologists, they're mind reading, they mutilate cows, they leave crop circles. They are threatening in their very superiority because of their superior technology, which is never available to us because the I-beam has disappeared. Now, I think what's going on here is all of these are proxies for preternatural evil, for evil or morally ambiguous forces that are here. We want some of us to think that that I-beam really existed because it would be proof of the existence of aliens. And this brings me to my final test case tonight, or you might say example. And this is a practice of scientific hallucinations. And they involve someone who worked over here in Flagstaff, an immensely wealthy man from Boston. He was a Brahmin family, Percival Lowell House at Harvard and the like. Now, some of you may know from your childhood that there were people who would squint, not at agate bowls, but they would squint through inferior telescope technology of the time and see canals. Now, think of how convulsive that would have been at that moment when you had scientists with Harvard credentials looking up and seeing examples of creatures that were not mentioned in the Bible, that were not known to humanity before that point. He would see changes going on, and it was conjectured that these canals were a response to that dry, highly desiccated planet, but it showed that there were intelligences, that there were sentient beings, not like angels or devils, but there on a different planet. Now, no less an authority than the Gray Lady, the New York Times says here, there can be no doubt at all that there is life on the planet Mars. And there you can see the telescope, which is a scientific validation. You can see Percival Lowell's formal portrait, and then you see the physical testimony of all of the canals on Mars. This became a craze. This has been explored in a wonderful book by David Barron recently. There's sheet music produced about Mars, and then my favorite is Mars' first message to us is not about theology. It's as grubby as the devil's note. But this case, they want some pear soap. Please send it as soon as you can. Now, so why is that being set aside? It's and isolated first. It's because it's meant to be real. It's meant to be scientifically attested. You go through this process of affidavits. It's almost, again, laying out the argument in a way that reasonable or rational people potentially can access and subscribe to. Now let's speak about Martian writing that comes to us, purportedly, through miraculous visions. And this takes us to a figure who is endlessly exciting. She was born Catherine Elise Müller, Swiss, but later as a pseudonym, in order partly to protect her, she began to work with one of the founders of French psychology, Théodore Fleurot. She began having in 1900 visions from Mars, and this is the writing that she saw there. The Martian cycle and language. And if you look at it, you'll see all of the same earmarks. It's laid out as a mimic of writing. It's laid out in such a way that you should be able to recognize intuitively that this is writing. Now, she had other messages coming to her by these visitations through spirits coming from ultramars. I imagine it's an asteroid belt or something like that. These look eerily like electrical diagrams. They're entirely jagged. There is a new aesthetic about writing here, which is not what you'd seen before. This is my favorite page from the research being done by Fleurot and working with Hélène Smith, which is she's isolated all of the roles of people on the planet. There's someone who looks for water, makes sense with the canals, but then I love the dog breeders. They seem to be indispensable to the Martian civilization. Virgin girl, page after page of this. The impact of this psychic cannot be understated. We have never heard of her. Probably most of you have not. And that's because her impact created modern psychology. It led to all sorts of work in linguistics. It led to a modern artistic movement. So some of these people are doubtless known to you. William James, Varieties of Religious Experience. Ferdinand de Saussure, one of the great early structural linguists, perhaps the greatest. Carl Jung, for heaven's sake. And then down below, looking and peering into nothingness, André Breton, who was, of course, the surrealist. Why were they fascinated by this? Because they weren't taking her at her word. They didn't accept that she was actually receiving these messages visually or otherwise or kinetically from Mars, but rather they told us about the human psyche. They were folding back and refracting into a statement about humanity, and we need to think about Hélène Smith and her impact. Now, I mentioned before, we should always analyze these kind of systems as though we might a writing system being employed by humans, because they are being employed by a human. These are, however, a little bit different, and they're rhomboids, they have zigzags, always with 5 lines. There's even a kind of symmetry going on with them, and in a nice touch, they correspond to the handedness of Hélène Smith. They're zipping off to the right, because clearly she's right-handed. So, as I conclude this, I wanted to reiterate why in the world we would be interested in this subject. And believe me, there's a much longer topic. I cut out a lot of other images. Maybe we should have a part 2 at some point if you're up for it. But it is worth reflecting about the usefulness of examining this domain of otherworldly writing, writing of the uncanny, writing that is said to be non-human. Now, why do I say that? Because, first of all, they're great examples of secondary script invention. And I've already indicated to you that this is a common phenomenon around the world, and it needs to be studied more. I might do a book with my colleague on it. We haven't really decided that as yet. But in all of these, you see the same thing. Kerning, you're aware of this from having worked with fonts, with Apple and the like. They have even kerning. They're all calibrated, maybe excepting that peculiar kind of electrical jagged writing that was conducted to us by Hélène Smith. They have distinct sign classes. There's a linearity to them. And they seem to be language mimics, one thing after the other. I would also, as I conclude here and come to an end, is to say that there's also a lot of evidence that these are replete with paradoxes. And I would venture to say, in fact, and tell you that those paradoxes are what probably inject the uncanny into these writing systems. Think of it. It's writing that really isn't meant to be read. In the case of Hildegard of Bingen, too. And not only that, they play around with that concept of the preternatural as opposed to the supernatural, and that they are in themselves concrete miracles. They are works of astonishment. And they always, therefore, play around with, toy with, whether you're a Roswell aficionado or not, with this idea that there is a belief out there if we can only find material evidence in which to confirm it. I would also say, among the other paradoxes that give it this special attribute that just buzzes with oddity and strangeness, is that they're both timeless and within time. They're created in these certain moments. They're inflected by humanist alphabets that were being devised at that time, but are also held to be the products of supernatural beings that existed long before us. They're both fundamentally cultural, because that is what writing is. It's something we learn and transmit and we develop in particular social circumstances, and they also purport to be pre-cultural. And then there's this emotional development, this emotional attribute, a set of attributes that we need to be focusing on, which is they impute to other worlds the emotions of this world. And what would they include? Well, there's awe, there's terror, there's wonder, there's disquiet, anxiety, hope, and as you saw for some of these documents, greed, the most squalid, grubby of human emotions, and here you see it being used by supernatural forces. As I pull away from this topic, I would also like to get a little bit philosophical with you. There's actually a book out there called Exophilosophy, but we don't need to look at that. We can go back to a very influential work by the philosopher Thomas Nagel, published in 1972. And what he did was he posed a simple but profound question, which is, can we enter into the mind of a bat? Can we think like a bat? Can we experience the world like a bat? That is, how do we enter into a radically different sensibility that requires heroic efforts of imagination? Now, I'm not going to get into controversies about Nagel. There are many there among philosophies. But consider this for a moment. Think of animals that hear what we cannot hear. Think of animals that see what we cannot see, that smell what we cannot smell, that feel what we cannot feel. This is the predicament here. This is the conundrum, which is, how do we think like an alien? Particularly in these productions that purport to channel somehow what aliens might do. There are all sorts of perils, I think, to this world of anthropomorphism, but I think as we ask this question, it also folds back on us, which is, do we really think aliens would write this way? What if aliens communicated by splotches of pheromones? What if they were creatures of smell? What if they had other senses that would be registered in this way? These are all reductively visual. They're all being presented in a format that you would expect of human writing. And so what if they didn't even have language? The movie Arrival deals with this to some extent. So here in my concluding image, I wanted to tell you and underscore the fact that what I see above all in all of these examples is a profound poverty of human imagination. That is, what we're looking at here is a deeply human incapacity to transcend our own frames of reference in creating these things of these impossibly different sorts of people, beings that are wholly unlike. And so what we perceive above all with the otherworldly is not otherworldly at all. They reflect notions of writing. I've gone through all of these test cases, and I think you see that they participate in the same modes of graphic communication. And so what they do is they never achieve escape velocity. They never escape the limitations of human models. And if there's anything that the writing of devil's angels and aliens tell us in this otherworldly writing that I presented for you tonight, is that it has one overriding trait, which is that it is inescapably human. Thank you. I believe it's customary to take questions. So.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit more about it's interesting in the Roswell document, there's that reference to the hypnotically retrieved, and thinking about runes and the way that Odin hypnotically retrieves the runes from the water beneath the Yggdrasil. And these states like Hilma af Bingham, where are you thinking in terms of that, besides just like it's an othering? Like what is the inquiry inside the hypnotic state?
Yeah, there are many wonderful studies by people like Piers Kelly about secondary script invention throughout Southeast Asia, for instance. And typically they come into existence through circumstances of messianism or through spiritual trances. And so I've touched very gingerly on the subject of sincerity. That is, I think the letter from Spoletano that we saw there, I think it's completely bogus, but for some of these other ones, like with Hildegard of Bingen, who can deny that she's going through these impassioned states of entrancement? And so I think a lot of these do come into conditions not of overt graphic design, but they're thinking it through in ways that are being channeled through their souls. They're being channeled through an entranced experience. And so I think with a lot of these, that's where it's coming from. The greatest example of all, and I again encourage you to go to the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, is to see that amazing work by Hampton, which is his altar, made out of tinfoil and cardboard, but it is luminous with human spirit. And then in a small vitrine over to the side, they show his single book, which he appears to have produced over a period of about 20 to 30 years. And there is no doubt at all as to his sincerity. He was a very deeply spiritual person. He went to a number of churches in Washington, D.C., where he lived. But nonetheless, he felt they were all in an impure state and that he was the true conduit to an understanding of these alternative spiritual realities. So absolutely it's important. Absolutely it's crucial. Now, the whole Roswell thing, it's hard for me to evaluate. It's 50 years after the event. It's all based on the testimony of these two members of one family. And we don't have the I-beam. Yes.
Thanks,
Michael.
Stephen, for presenting this material, which I dare say most of us have never even known anything about or seen before. Just a quick question. Your talk made me think of the phenomenon of glossolalia, of speaking in tongues, which is obviously oral and not written. So did work on that actually inform your analysis, or do you really consider it a separate phenomenon?
No, I would call it descriptive poiesis as well. And in fact, it's a term that my colleagues share with me. Clearly it is. And this is why people like Carl Jung and Fleroy and these other scholars at the turn of the 19th and 20th century were interested in this, because they explicitly likened it to glossalia. Michel de Certeau wrote about this phenomenon in a famous piece in Representations, a journal, and absolutely it's connected to it. Yeah, and so there's a meaning beyond meaning. The inherent mysticism is that impossibility of easily accessing things through the script. And this would not be true with the other sorts of writing systems that most of us conventionally employ. When we make a note, although my handwriting is terrible, I want to be able to read it later. These are accessed by different means. And I have to say that when you look at Hildegard of Bingen's alphabet, it's never used again. appears once. We have no other instances of it. What is of interest to her, getting back to your question, is the miraculous element. It came out of the blue. All of the examples of devil's writing are obviously ad hoc improvisations. They're all different from one another. I think they occur at the moment. Yeah, so absolutely it's connected. Yes, yeah.
Otherworldly writing, but it's not otherworldly language. So it seems that it's very visual and it's not trying to communicate. Like it's not, I'm sure there must be some of them that were, but I wondered if you thought about that, the difference between just, as you said, something that was put down for whatever versus trying to communicate.
Well, I've written extensively about what I call pseudoglyphs or pseudo-writing. And it's a tradition found in many parts of the world, very, very common among the Maya, in which they are creating, almost in an artistic sense, the look of writing. And that's what you're getting with here. You're getting the look of a writing that might have been produced by a devil. And let's just add that additional flourish with the whiplash tails and the pitchforks. That one was so heavy-handed, I think it's particularly preposterous. But yeah. Yeah, Oma.
Thank you. That was a really breathtaking view in a way that few anthropologists would have the audacity to do, and I really admire
I am, if nothing,
the
audacious.
many centuries and continents that you're traversing. And right at the end, I think you were hinting at something that interested me, which was all of these writings might have been occurring at particular moments where messianism was occurring. And I couldn't help thinking from your first example, 16th century, what's going on in Europe? Well, the
Right.
Edict of Expulsion just had happened recently,
And
first in Spain.
1492.
Right, and 1496 followed in Portugal, and that was a moment where otherness was expelled from the peninsula, and the effort was to expel otherness from the immediate experience of humans, and yet that particular example was likened potentially, if I understood you correctly, to a Proto-Hebrew, which would have been associated with...
I hasten to add, these are not my theories, but
Okay.
they were held by 16th century alchemists,
Yes,
like
sure.
John Dee, Elizabeth I magician. Yes, so yeah, it was an idea they were playing around with.
So I'm just, in my mind, playing around with the notion of what is worth othering at a particular moment in history and why, and Europe was othering like crazy right as the Portuguese explorers were discovering other worlds around the world, and they were bringing home these tales of creatures that may or may not have been human, and the whole bounds of what is human, and can humans have tails, and so forth, all these fantastical tales.
Yeah, and Kircher and other people were recording Aztec writing. They were beginning to reproduce it, not in a way that showed any real understanding of the subject. But I would say this is a universal. This is happening, particularly in Southeast Asia. You see a lot of writing systems developing in these areas that, of course, James Scott wrote about in one of his later books, which was about this zone of rebellion or resistance. I think the individual or scholars who's really looked at this the most perceptively is Piers Kelly. And it's a great ethnographic topic, and this is what he works with as well, in that he's going out and speaking to the people who are creating the writing systems. We can't do that for James Hampton, but there's a very fruitful process here of looking at these circumstances. Runic is a classic example. I think it's coming into existence in which you've got the Romans pushing into the Germanic zone. There's a lot of contact going on and probably consternation in a cultural sense about how we're going to define ourselves. And so they come up with this runic writing system, which I think all of us believe patently is based on Latin models. But it's different, and this is why it led to some controversy about its origin, because it's sufficiently different to show this is the script of the Scandinavians and allied peoples.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I just had a question, just trying to, I don't spend a lot of time looking at, ancient texts, but I'm just wondering how something like emojis fit into this schema of primary and secondary, sort of they're preternatural in themselves, that are inside and outside language and can communicate both the quotidian and something mystical.
Yeah, well, I mean, you doubtless have seen Zhu Bing's book in which he attempts to Write His Diary, an emoji. It's published by MIT Press. I urge all of you to look at it. And it's remarkably hard to understand. You make out that he likes eggs, and he likes them fried in the morning, and he likes hot coffee. But the sequencing, which he attempts to communicate exclusively through emojis, is a little bit hard to sort out. And you can suss it out because he has a translation in the back in English, or presumably the original was in Chinese. Now, emojis are a great example of something we think is non-cultural and is profoundly cultural. Because if the younger people back here, or there's some residential scholars here who would know this, that a pear in one context means something very different to whether you're 66 years old or whether you're among the young of the world. And so there have constant layerings going on. There's a constant attempt to three-dimensionalize them, of course, as we get into enhanced computer technologies, which allow you to include those kind of graphic discriminations in the writing. And so, yeah, I've looked at a lot at emojis. I teach a class on graphic systems, in fact, and we deal with those. But the larger point is, of course, Xu Bing's, he did the Book of the Sky, I think all of you probably know, and which was all in fake Chinese characters and puzzled and baffled people. But what he is, of course, saying is you can understand this writing system whether you're speaking Chinese or Albanian or, I don't know, Sanskrit, and I don't believe it. I think it's very simple messages might be communicated, but there's already been a social agreement about what messages are being communicated with those particular signs, as with the pears and other strangely erotic emblems that I blush to talk about. So, yeah, anyway, I think that's, yeah.
Thanks for your talk. I was struck by some of the common patterns you described. A lot of these otherworldly writing systems having, like the handedness and the symmetry and moving from left to right and so on. And you also mentioned crop circles at one point, and I was struck by the fact that they are more in a kind of a mandalic form that's more mathematical and symmetrical across axes rather than moving across a line and down a page. And we're just curious how you think about that as a language system.
Well, what I had to cut out here in a larger version, I think this will become a separate paper, is of course the writing system of the squid heptapods in Arrival. And those are really fascinating to me because those are purported attempts by the designer who's from Quebec, to create a writing system that's completely semasiographic. And if you've read the novella by Ted Chiang, it's all about the creatures that live in all dimensions of time simultaneously and so forth. And so hence they're going to do a perfect circle. And then there are minute gradations around there which will inject other kinds of nuances. What I find fascinating about that too is the impoverishment of the graphic design, which is, I've spent some time in Japan. It's obvious they're ripping off the Enso sign from Zen Buddhism, which are circles which are meant to indicate perfection of time and of a complete comprehension of time simultaneously. And it does baffle me that those people behind that particular script in Arrival, these are the bits of ink they shoot out, right, for those of us who've seen the movie, that they don't acknowledge its obvious source, which is ripping off Japanese Zen Buddhism and from that tradition. So I think it would be an interesting seminar we could run here at the SCR, which is to contemplate what would non-human writing be like if it just consists of splotches of color or pheromones. I was very influenced over the last couple of weeks reading that great book by Ed Yong, which is all about sensing the world. I think it was maybe a finalist for the National Book Award. But he makes the point that creatures that we think of are very much like us aren't really at all. So that a lobster will communicate with its mate by injecting urine into the water nearby, and that would indicate perhaps receptivity, if I understood that correctly. And that would be an interesting thought experiment, to really go outside what would be the possible, but again, it's always being channeled through a very earthly experience, very terrestrial encounter with other kinds of animals. What if these are crystal creatures? Do they grow crystals? You can go any which way. My whole point, though, in this particular presentation was they never do. When they create these, it's enough to maybe fool some of the people, but ultimately a conviction or complete state of persuasion is impossible.
Talk about the non-human as well as the human. You were talking about lobsters, and I think the Nagel essay has been extraordinarily influential on biologists who study animals. And not only do lobsters do that thing with the urine, but they have enormous numbers of little cilia on their bodies that can interpret what's in the water, the nutrients of the water. So they're kind of reading the language of the water in ways that we couldn't possibly do. We go in, we go wet, but for a lobster, it's an entire world and a world of meaning. And they're doing that with birds and elephants, and people are literally trying to say, okay, well, they can't count to 10, but what can they do? And it turns out they can do a lot of things very, very well if we try to meet them, however imperfectly, on their own terms. I'd also like to say a little personal thing about this, too, is that I remember when I was quite young, 3 or 4 years old, my father would come back home, and he'd have a copy of the New York Times that he'd brought back on the train. And all those New York Timeses usually went back behind a stand behind the piano. And I remember being fascinated by them because I couldn't read at that point. And I would take some down and I would look, and I thought I would never be able to do it, possibly because there were 8 columns on a page in the New York Times in those days and not 6. But one day I remember there was a gathering, and I took a copy of the New York Times, and I just sat down around my parents and their friends, and I pretended that I could read the New York Times. And everything got very, very quiet. And I remember thinking, I think I got it, you know? I mean, they're listening to me. But eventually I realized that I was being indulged, and I thought, well, I'm never going to do this again. But I did notice that both our children did the same thing. They would pretend that they could read, and our same grandchildren would at one point, around that time of age, would pretend that they could read. And it's almost like it's a very deep human desire to do something like that.
Well, of course, none of us are born knowing how to read. So it's an acquired skill, and you have to be trained in it. That's what makes this genre of text so fascinating, because they do have this kind of miraculous single moment that seems to go on in a revelation. But this is a point made by David Lurie as well in his many publications, which is none of us, these are not genetic attributes. These are things that are acquired through learning and the like. And I think we like to imitate people we admire. So kudos to you, Philip. Well, I think this is a properly exhausted audience. And so anyway, thank you for coming tonight.